Hello, I'm Maureen Greeley, Executive Director of the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling and host of Kaleidoscope, Reflections of Diverse Views on Mental Health Equity. Today, we're going to be speaking about issues related to veterans, active duty military, and their loved ones. And I'm so excited to have our guests, Dr. Heather Chapman, who is Director of the Gambling Treatment Program at the Cleveland VA Medical Center, Dr. Ty Lawstutter, Training Director and Psychology Internship Program at the University of Washington, and Dave Yeager, a U.S. Army veteran in recovery and the host of the Fall In podcast for military service members and veterans. So let's start there, actually, Dave. Why a podcast devoted to military service members and veterans just about problem gambling?
Well, I kind of got hooked on it when I started to listen to podcasts just in general about problem gambling and got amazed at how it raises awareness and kind of takes away some of the stigma of what this disease really is. And myself being a veteran in recovery who actually fell into my addiction while I was on active duty, I kind of felt like it would be a great platform for me to get the message out there to service members, to veterans, to people who might be concerned about it, that they're not alone, that this is very real and that there's more of us that you know, and there is help available. So those are my main reasons for wanting to start this podcast.
Great. And of course, gambling disorder or problem gambling is part of an overall public health issue, mental health issue. So let's talk about that a little bit. Regardless of the branch of service, regardless of active or veteran status, the era you served or the area of deployment, what do we need to understand and what questions do we need to ask to better serve our military families and our active duty and veterans? Tell me a little bit about what you do in your jobs and how you approach that.
So I can start. I think problem gambling remains sort of like the Cinderella of addictions. It remains one of those. I think what we see a lot are substance use disorders kind of lumped together and attended to, and process addictions, gambling being the first noted by the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders. It tends to not get the notice, and part of that is because it is a kind of a quieter. It speaks quieter. It's not as loud. There's not some real obvious issues, at least initially. So one of the things I think it's important is for people to just, was a campaign for National Council for Problem Gambling some years ago, is have the conversation, is for people to bring it up within the context of mental health issues, particularly if there's issues about debt, about paying bills, about homelessness. If there's issues about suicidality, those are sort of like the low-hanging fruit that may indicate that there might be a problem with gambling, and ask a few questions. The other thing that I would say is important, a lot of these questions or screens for gambling are helpful, and they've been demonstrated to have good that are efficient and helpful in identifying a gambling problem. A lot of times people might not want to talk about a gambling problem because that's not what they came in the door for. So typically asking about these issues within the context of what do you do with your time? What do you do for fun and recreation? Rather than throwing them in as like a separate screen. Because what you get is, I'm not like a thought bubble of, I'm not going to talk about that. I'm here for my PTSD, or I'm here for feeling depressed today, or I'm here for having my, whatever checked. So again, it's just kind of being mindful of, how we approach it, and the importance of approaching it in some way, in a way that would be most received or best received by the person that you're talking to.
I agree with Heather. And I think that is why I think it is hard, both as people who train clinicians, that they need to include one more point of assessment, because as both Dave and Heather have pointed out, they're stigmatized and people don't really bring these issues out themselves. They don't normally come seeking. A lot of them don't come seeking and saying, I have a gambling problem. What they do is, as Heather was saying, they have lots of other symptoms that look like they could be lots of different reasons why that symptom. And a lot of times providers miss the underlying cause, which might hold all of this together, is the gambling problem that no one wants to talk about. And I do think that we as a field also need to do a better job assessing for it. And I think you assess for it in a couple of different ways. One is we do have really good brief screens that at least get the conversation started, as Heather said. And the other is, once you've got some positivity on that, or I even like the way Heather did it. The other time is sometimes asking in a screen won't get you the answer because people are leery about telling you. And so it is sometimes asking instead, how do you spend your time and what do you do? And I will normally, when people tell me they've gone to a casino, again, most people don't have a gambling problem, but I do actually know it's a potential for a problem. And so I might ask in a very gentle way. So at least when I'm trying to train the new incoming psychologist into the field, I try to get them to think about, like, look, this is not and I'll be honest, was not an issue or a thing that I got taught in grad school. This was a thing that came to me separately. And so I do want people to put it on the treatment provider's radar that we can have these conversations and you can assess for it in a couple of different ways. And then once you find people who are willing to have the conversations and they do have problems, we have really good treatments. And letting the providers know what kind of treatments they could provide, and a lot of the way they've been trained will actually adapt really well for treating gambling, and letting Dave and his podcast and populations knowing that there are treatments that if you came in a treatment, we can help you adjust your gambling behavior if you're willing to have the conversation with us around that as well. So I guess in some ways, getting people to know there are good treatments and and telling the field, this is the way you might think about it. Because I do think that sometimes people are like, oh, I don't know how to deal with that. So they would rather just give it away or refer to it or just ignore that it's an issue.
Yeah, and I'm gonna take that and flip it over to the other side of the coin and talk about service members and veterans and the people that are doing the work in this. You guys both who are doing such strong work in this area, getting people in front of you is the number one key. So how do we do that? We got to chip away at the brick wall, which is, I talked to a number of different non-commissioned officers and veterans that say that when they were in their units, when you start talking about the signs and symptoms of gambling and some of the struggles that some of us have gone through, they're like, oh yeah, I know a guy who went through that. Oh yeah, now that you say it, it's just nobody's talking about it. Nobody's bringing it up as an issue. So if I had walked into the slot machine room that I walked into in Korea, which is kind of where all of this got started for me, and I had seen a poster on the wall that said, these are the signs and symptoms of a gambling addiction, I'm not saying I wouldn't have fallen into a gambling addiction. What I'm saying is my eyes would have been drawn to that poster, and you never know when something started happening. At least if I know it's sitting there, maybe I'm more likely to go to somebody and say, hey, I have some of those signs and symptoms that are up on that wall. What can you do for me? So from that perspective, I think just opening up that door and just putting those words in front of people to say, this is a real thing, will make a huge difference.
I love that difference. Talk to me a little bit more, all of you, about the military culture, or Dave, you even called it the warrior ethos, that what is an individual bumping up against that is making it difficult for them to come forward when they are active duty, or even veterans when they're back in civilian life?
I can start if that's okay. It starts on day one of basic training when you are shoved onto a cattle car, and pretty much from that moment forward in your military career, you're told that everything that's going on in your personal life has to be put away because you have a job to do. Forget your feelings, forget what's going on here. You're going to tuck it all away. You have a mission to accomplish. And I understand why the military does that. We did have a mission to accomplish. They have a mission to accomplish. And you need to be able to focus on the training and the skills that we're given in order to accomplish that mission, because in a lot of cases, people are being put in harm's way to get it done. So you need to be able to focus to get that done. What happens, though, in that military culture is you learn to rely on the guy next to you on either side of you. If I'm in the foxhole, the two guys on the foxhole on either side of me are my best friends in the world. So you learn to create a bond between people to rely on each other to get things done. that kind of extends itself if you go beyond that. And now let's say you're at the back end of your career, or you're brought back from a deployment, or you're being let out of the military. I can talk from my own personal experience to say nobody really taught me how to unpack what I was taught how to pack. Mm-hmm. So they taught me how to pack the duffel bag, but never really taught me how to unpack the duffel bag. So when all of these uncomfortable feelings come up and all of these things come up that I don't want to deal with, for me, that slot room, that gambling was my outlet. You know, the ethos says, you know, I'll never yield, I'll never accept defeat, I'll never surrender, all those sorts of things. So even when I became a veteran and I was still gambling and I knew that I had a problem, right, I had to solve it on my own. Nobody was going to solve this for me. I wasn't going to make it anybody else's issue. I wasn't going to the VA because they weren't going to solve it. I had to solve it on my own. I had to outsmart it. I had to outthink it. I had to outmuscle it, until I finally came to the realization that none of that was working. No matter how hard I tried, I was going to continue trying to do it that way. And that's because that's the way I was taught to do it. I was taught if there's an issue, you figure out the problem, you get through the problem, and you drive on.
Yeah, I think culture, more and more within the auspices of mental health treatment, we're paying more and more attention to culture and cultural influences on behavior. And you know, I've been lucky enough, fortunate enough, I don't know if there's luck, but fortunate enough to work in a program that works not just with military culture, but cultures from all over the United States. So different people from different walks of life, all over the United States. And what I found that's so interesting is generally how the United States culture is not very well versed in military culture, because fewer and fewer of us have family or friends who go into the military, unlike at least some of us, our dads and our granddads, uncles, great uncles, and so forth that were involved in the military. When you have people that you know that have been in the military, you're much more likely to understand what it is, what the culture is. When you don't have that, and again, fewer and fewer do, and what we're seeing is more military culture families that they use, that is part of their culture to join the military. And so they keep it within those little families. So it is really important for us to understand, you know, how military culture really changes or really molds someone into a specific type of person, because again, they have a charge, they have something that they need to do that's very focused. We all have cultures too in our own work. You know, I have the treatment culture. I've always said the culture of being in a counseling room is weird. You know, we have this kind of idea that people are going to come in, and maybe people feel like they have to like fulfill this, like I've got to go in there and like spill my guts. You know? So there's a culture in that too, and there's a culture in like how we walk around in a hospital and how we do with each other. So it's really important to understand the influence that has on who we are as people and how we even see the world. Now, certainly when you see that, and I think Dave did a great job talking about that, you know, not giving up piece that happens, like surrender is not an option in the military. And when you use even like the 12-step terminology, part of it's about surrender. And there's a lot of people that look at you like, what do you know? You know, I am not going to surrender. I'm not going to give up. You know, I'm not powerless. What is powerlessness? No way, Jose. I'm not doing that. So it's really interesting to kind of like look at that and appreciate that. I had someone say today to me after reviewing some testing, this makes me feel weak. You know, and weakness doesn't go in the service, and so that was very difficult for him. And so understanding the context of that within the culture of what he's bringing, you know, that he's in, that he's very, very well, you know, rested in, is really important. rather than argue, like, it doesn't mean you're weak, it means you're strong, just like he'd look at me like, what are you talking about? Of course it's weak. Look at that. And so it's really kind of sitting with him as he sits and grapples with this. And what does this mean for him as a person now? And allow him or help him arrive at the strength that he's bringing to, face, the issues of gambling. He didn't like the word recovery either. So it's interesting. You have to be very mindful of the language and how it fits with the person and how it fits with warrior or military culture, or warrior ethos and military culture.
And that language is very important when we start to talk about bringing someone in and asking them questions on a standardized assessment or screening tool. How can we make that more normalized and more safe for people so that it does, as Tana Russell noted, become a regular part of an annual mental health screening and assessment? What are you seeing as clinicians?
Like, I can comment at least when I did my internship at a VA, and I will say I was rather impressed because, believe it or not, part of their system, very military-like from where they came from, was they just implemented standardized questions on things. And at least some people took it more seriously than others. But the idea of just asking 2 simple questions around alcohol use, it was always asked every year annually. And over time, so I'm going to agree, we're not going to change this problem overnight, right? It is that the more that we can figure out ways to implement this but I will say the VA is a national healthcare program that takes care of all our veterans from Hawaii to, New York City. It's everywhere. And so the idea that they as a health system can influence an entire country culture. And I will say a lot of non-VAs actually learn their healthcare from the VAs. The VA does a good job of, here's what's working for us. And then other healthcare systems adapt that. So we learn a lot from VA systems because they are well regulated and do a lot of output and a lot of research. And I remember them discussing the fact that people who implemented we call it the audit or the audit C. It's a very brief question around alcohol use and just implementing that. And over years now, I remember when it first came out, everyone's like, no one's going to answer it. No one's going to do it. And everyone argued about it. And now I can tell you that almost any VA and most people who've been to the VA will tell you, have you been asked about the following 3 questions on alcohol? The answer is always yes. And no one gives it a second thought now. Right. And I had an advisor who was one of the foremost researchers of alcohol. And I was a grad student, and when I would come to him and share with him the experiences that we were dealing with in gambling research, gambling treatment, all of these things, he would say that field is about 30 years behind where alcohol is, because alcohol had been so pervasive and such a problem that people are willing to do, but they went through the same struggle. So I will actually say the parallel is we're going to get there. The fact that we're on a program right now discussing it suggests to me that we're going to get there. It just takes some time. And I will say it takes leadership at the top of these large healthcare programs to implement a brief screen that will be given to everyone on an annual basis. So that's my view of how you change therapeutic cultures and in some ways the greater culture by implementing these healthcare systems. And I agree, not everyone's going to respond to it. Not everyone. I understand that there are still some, but I do think it does change over time. That people start to see it seriously and start. The other thing is, once you've identified the problem, you've got to be able to give them help. And so being able to also then translate to what help you're going to get is the other piece of this. And so I think that we're working on this. It's a work in progress. But I will just say in my years of doing this work, it's gotten better. It's still not where it needs to be, but we are getting there. We are making a difference in the culture, both military slowly and the civilian outside world of the military afterwards.
Absolutely. 100%. We've never been busier. And we've been with COVID, we've been quite creative in how we deliver treatment. We're doing much more virtual care. For years, we were known as the residential program, and now we're by and large a virtual program with some residential components to it, and which I think is appropriate because a lot of people can do okay with residential. I do think to get people to start talking about gambling, it starts with the clinicians. It starts with informing clinicians, helping them see, doing some, brief training that they'll go to, not too much, simple, straightforward strategies. And yeah, like Ty said, talking about really helping them understand, okay, when I identify this problem, I need something to tell them like where they're going to go. And so helping people have tools in their toolbox, whether it's they're implementing it or someone else, to get the ball rolling here. And that I've seen tremendous changes over the years that I've been with the VA. So that's quite exciting, actually.
Let's turn that and talk a little bit about the awareness and understanding that's needed from the clinician's standpoint, from the family member standpoint, from general civilian population. None of us who haven't served can truly walk in someone else's boots in this case. We might have some understanding that trauma in a physical war zone can translate into mental, emotional war zone as well. What are some of the risk factors, and what do we need to be aware of when we're trying to respect and serve military members and veterans?
So I guess I could start. I think that I'm reminded of right when Desert Storm, actually OIF and OEF in Iraq and Afghanistan, those wars were started. The chief of psychology that I was working with and I were having a conversation, and I said, "There's something different with this group." And that back then we were south of Cleveland. We're more in a kind of a suburban area. And I said, people they're missing more treatment, and there's some kind of reluctance about getting in a car. And, we're trying to think it through. And then I talked more to some veterans, and they said, that's where you die. Yeah. Is being in a car and being in a traffic jam on 77 north or south in Cleveland, where it gets really, really crowded. And it's like understanding that was really important with the timing of when they're coming in to see you. It was huge. And instead of seeing as like, oh, they're being treatment resistant, that was the equivalent of a tree line for folks in Vietnam. So it really kind of shifted. And when these things shift, it's not necessarily on our radar initially when we're treatment providers. We see it a little bit after the fact. So it's really kind of being curious about their reactions to, when they come in and why they come in, and, what it's like to be sitting in a group, the whole dance around who gets to sit in different chairs in the group room and who has their eyes on the door, which is always a thing, because people with PTSD, by and large, settle themselves so that they have a view of the whole room. So kind of understanding those pieces, I think are key as a treatment provider. For someone with military sexual trauma, there's yet another layer to that, and understanding and appreciating the impact that you might have as a treatment provider. They might have a reaction to a male treatment provider or a female treatment provider, depending on what's going on. So these pieces, I think, need to be appreciated, that the behavior not necessarily like pathologized or labeled as something, but as a provider, being curious about the behaviors and what they might be about, what might be going on, and asking the question, saying, I noticed this. Can you tell me more about what's going on? I had a guy years ago, he was from rural Idaho, and he's sitting in our group room, and he kind of was having a challenge in our program. And I just asked something like, you feel like feel a little different here. I wasn't sure what was going on. And he said, yeah. And what he was reacting to was being in a city, being in Cleveland, Ohio. It threw him off and he didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to act. He didn't know the language. He wore camo every day. He didn't know how to it was a new language for him. It was a new place for him. He didn't know what to do with it. And once we got through that, then we were able to kind of get some work done. He goes, okay, you get me now, and we were able to kind of move forward. So I just think it's being curious about them, not jumping to a sort of a pathological labeling of what might be going on.
Yeah, I want to kind of bounce on that and give it from the person sitting in the group room perspective, if I can. One of the things that for me drew me the most into treatment and drew me the most into engaging in treatment was the feeling of connection. I can sit in front of many, many well-schooled clinicians who know exactly what they're talking about, and they know the DSM-5 from front to rear, and they can quote all this stuff, and maybe they're diagnosing whatever they're doing. But the Dr. Heather Chapmans of the world, who will sit across from me with all of the experience and education that she brings, but talk to me like she and I are just sitting on a park bench having a conversation and getting to know each other. That's what draws me into treatment. And in my opinion, watching other people around me, it's what draws them into treatment. What you just described there is a perfect example of that. You saw something that was different, and instead of taking a textbook approach to it, you learned more about what was going on. We, the people sitting in those chairs, for lack of a better word, we're the experts on who we are.
Mm-hmm.
The clinicians are the experts on how to navigate all that, but we're the experts on who we are. So getting to know who we are and where we stand and meeting us where we are and kind of guiding us from there, I think is huge.
Dave, can you expand a little bit on that? I think that sense of connection, and earlier you talked about bonding in the trenches. Outside of the counselor or the clinician, how important is that lived experience and that bonding and connection with your peers, with other people who have served, in terms of your podcast, in terms of support groups? What's out there and how important is that?
I'm going to talk about connection first and foremost. I have been twice into treatment for gambling addiction. The first time being in 2007, where I did go to that small town just south of Cleveland and was there. And then again in 2020, when I got to experience it in Cleveland itself. The difference between those two journeys was that the first time through, I engaged in the treatment. I did the aftercare treatment. I was going to groups. And then eventually I thought, I've got this. I can handle it. I'm feeling good. Everything's great. I'm going to let all this go. I don't need to go to meetings anymore. I don't need to go to counseling anymore. I can just go out and take care of my life now. I'm cured, right? The difference now is I know that the only way for me to stay strong in my own recovery is to stay connected to my recovery. I do that through a couple of different methods. And one of them is I do attend a weekly Gamblers Anonymous meeting. Now, it's a mixed mishmash of different people, but the connection to gambling addiction is strong in that room, and we all feed off each other in order to gain strength from each other to move forward. When I'm having the crappiest of days, I can go into that room and talk about that day, and there's not a person in that room that doesn't understand at some level what I'm going through. The other thing that I do is I work part-time in a treatment center where I host a veterans group a couple of times a week, and I also do a psychoeducational on problem gambling. The ability to connect with veterans for me brings another element to it, in that I can stand in that room, and as I'm going through that group and we're going through a topic, we're all connecting. I'm not even really, I sit down and I become part of the circle. I'm not even the guy standing in front of anybody drawing on a board. I'm just, let me throw this out there and let's talk about this as veterans. You combine the two of those for me, and I can talk about my experience the last time I was in Cleveland, which would have been February of 2020. There were 9 of us sitting in a room. The connection between the 9 of us, even though we were all different generations, we had different experiences, we had different backgrounds, there are people from that group to this day that I'm still in contact with from 5 weeks sitting in that room, because the connection that we felt between each other. there's so much more power in the power of the collective moving towards that unified goal than there is any one of us could ever contribute to that whole thing. So that group has way more power than I do. So I always tell people, when when I'm sponsoring somebody or I have somebody ask me questions, I say connection is one of the three things I always preach to people. I always preach roadblocks, accountability, and connection. And connection to me is probably the most important, because without that connection, if you say, no, I can handle it, you're setting yourself up for danger. So.
And the research is clear on that, on the neurobiological changes that happen when you have that connection. There's actually, some dopaminergic activity that happens when you have that connection.
Well, I was going to even point out that in some ways, when I'm treating gamblers, that sometimes they tell me the connection they made is with the casino and the staff that is providing them connection.
Exactly.
So in reality, what they need, right, is a different connection. And that's one of the things we talk about is, if you were going to give up gambling, what are you going to do instead, right? The idea that if that serves as your connection, that is your social network.
Right.
And at the same time, it's coming, again, a lot of people don't have problems, but a lot of people do have problems with that connection. And it's not that those people who are working in the industry are bad. It's just that is the way they make their living. So they're not there to make that decision for you. So when sometimes it really is trying to find new connections, which is exactly what I agree with too. Both therapeutically, you want to connect with those that you are offering treatment, but also, and within group, but also think about the connection that you've built and how we're changing that connection to someone different, and what we would argue is a healthier for that individual, right? It's a healthier connection that we're going to now replace it or change to.
And I think it's fascinating, Tana's question there, comment. It's like, how do we do this? It's fascinating because the VA system is built on that. It's built on creating these connections. It's, from the get-go, like Cleveland was actually one of the earliest big, large VAs, in the country, because of so many people going to World War II and Vietnam from the greater Cleveland area. We're the third in the country, actually, as far as the numbers. And so they created these spaces, and in these spaces they created these groups to create connection. Vet centers do the same thing. VFWs do the same thing. So all of these posts, they have these places for veterans to get together and connect. And I think that in some ways it's sort of a natural progression. I think that people leave the service, and in some ways, in some respects, it's a natural progression. Now, obviously, in some of the VFWs, there's a lot of gambling going on, so it that takes some work on our part. But there is this sort of like natural tendency to have this connection. I think when you're talking about connection too, I think it's important to say the kind of connection that military members experience is probably unlike any other thing. Aside from maybe first responders, I'm not sure, but I don't know, like the truly being in the trenches with someone when someone's really has your back. Take the experience that you have in a sports team and exponentially change, make it deeper, because it truly is, these life-altering experiences that they have and require of each other. I think that connection piece is key. When we were redoing our program some years ago, and the thing that we always paid attention to in gambling research was abstinence. Are they gambling or not? And I'm like, well, there's so much more than that. And I'm like digging around through stuff, and NIDA had a little bit on this, but for me, it's like quality of life. And part of quality of life is social connection. And when you have someone that's gambling a lot and hiding out in a casino, which feels sometimes pretty social and a lot of times isn't, you end up with an issue where somebody has this feeling of wanting to connect and kind of connecting, and then feeling this real feeling of like emptiness. And our job is to kind of work with someone to create connection, and work with someone to create connection. And the thing that's great about veterans is, with our groups, is like they have two things in common. Not just do they have gambling problems, but they're all veterans. They've all been in the service. So it creates this automatic, like, I get you moment. And, it's like us going somewhere and meeting someone from our hometown. You feel a connection, or you meet someone from your college, you feel a connection, and it feels good. You feel something right away, right? And so it's that kind of thing that we're looking for. I had one group, this is the last thing, and I'll shift it over to you guys. I had one group where not only were they veterans and all had gambling problems, of course, but 4 out of the group members worked either currently or previously at the post office. So there was like this like post office handshake situation that they did. Again, another layer of connection, which, that's where you can get some change and some trust and some appreciation of each other.
And developing that connection when you're first transitioning from military service to civilian life, I can't be easy. No matter what you're doing, even if you're going back to your family, there's still a disconnect of misunderstanding or not being able to fully understand. We've got more than 22 million veterans in the US. More than 9 million of them are now over the age of 65, and 1.5 million or more are women. So I'd like to talk about the hero's welcome for everyone, that it's not enough to welcome veterans home with a thank you for your service. We hear that all the time. And I've heard service members say, sometimes that makes me feel uncomfortable because I'm not even sure what you mean, or I'm not sure you know what you mean. So what sorts of healthy choices and support services, not just clinicians, homelessness, suicide rates are high. What are all the touch points that we need to be thinking about to serve our service people properly?
I'm going to jump in on that if I can just for a second. I remember when I transitioned, and I transitioned a couple times into civilian life. You live in a world where everything is regulated. So there was structure. So if I had to talk to a subordinate, I could sit down across from that subordinate. I could strip away everything that was going on, and I could be very direct with that person. This is what you did. This is the impact that you've had, and this is what we're going to do to correct it. There's no other way around it. This is how it's going to happen. If you had trouble with a coworker, you resolved that at the lowest possible level, so it didn't escalate to the next level, because if it did, there was going to be trouble with that. So you figured out a way to get it fixed, and you got it fixed, and you moved on, and you got on to your next thing. Move that over into civilian life. I remember my first job as a manager with a company, and having a trouble employee. And I sat down with that employee, and I tried to use that kind of strip it away approach with the employee. Boy, that was an experience for me. I walked out of that room so frustrated because this person just started ranting and raving and yelling and screaming and saying they're going to go over my head, and they're going to call HR, and they're going to do this, and I'm going to be in trouble. And I literally was baffled going out of that conversation because we know what civilian life is. We know what civilian life is because we were all civilians before we went into the military. But when you step into it after a number of years of doing it, and you see the differences, and now you've gotten to experience what it's like to be through all that structure, and you step into this chaos, for lack of a better word, it's very confusing. And then you have family members who expect you to be the family member you were before you were in the military, or the family members that are around them that aren't in the military. And you walk in there, and maybe you're not engaging like everybody else is, or maybe your conversations are different, or maybe the conversations they're having are, I'm going to be honest, are boring to you because they're not the conversations that you're used to. And there's just not a way to explain to people, look, this is what I'm going through, because in a lot of cases, we don't even know. We're not even aware that this is what we're going through. We just know that I've been used to this being around, these walls being around me all the time. And now I'm in a different set of walls, and I don't know how to react. It's like just somebody took me to a different country and threw me in there, and I've got to learn the language because nobody speaks my language.
Wow.
Yeah, I will say what Dave just said is exactly right. It's an adjustment, right? Moving, it can be a big adjustment for people. And some people are quick and nimble at adjusting, and others find it really, really difficult. And there are lots of things that people like about military life that is structured in ways in which people they actually have grief and loss for, like when you leave. The closest I can ever, this is like, because I have not served, but the closest I can ever relate to my military family was I was a theater major who like worked on plays together. And when we would work on these big productions, it would be very intense. And I loved these people. I saw them every day for hours and hours and hours. And then when the play was over, we were done. And I remember being really depressed for about a month because I missed those relationships. Can you imagine that? Like Heather was saying, on a life and death basis, if this show does not go, you will all die. Like that's the way I imagined the military and that grief and loss of. And we can do that. If you think about it, what was interesting when I was an intern at the VA was this discussion of like, in the olden days of war, people would decompress together on a ship and get transferred here. Now with modern society, they can be home and back with their families within 48 to 72 hours, right? And then they're supposed to go back and act like the thing that they just saw didn't happen or not talk about. Like it is a lot of times we have not really thought forward. How do we help people? As Dave was saying, they start you on day one on how to become a military soldier or personnel of some sort. And we don't spend a lot of time as soon as you're discharged to do the opposite, to say, how do we help you now adjust back into non-military civilian?
Well, and how does the family adjust to having dad or mom back?
Yeah.
And when the other partner was doing everything before, and then it's like, well, then what's my role here now?
Yes.
And then that feeling of like, I don't feel like I have a role here now. And I did in the service. And then you'll see people redeploy because they feel more of a connection with that than the home life, because they've been sort of out of necessity in a way, disconnected, from the day-to-day operations of home. And so it's like, it's not like you can come back in immediately and know exactly that, Timmy has baseball on Thursday and Greta has ballet on Friday, and it's too much. It's like, okay, I'll still take care of this. You just sit over there.
And their experiences have also changed them. So the other thing is the things that they actually did in the military have changed who these people are and changed them in a way that their partners or family members aren't aware of, right? Like they don't know about why this person has changed and what experiences has come back. And it can be hard because I remember actually working with Vietnam era veterans who were like, I don't tell my wife what happened in Vietnam because she doesn't need that in her head. I have it in my head. And I will say the wedge between them was the wife wanted to know something. She's like, I don't have to get the gory details, but I need to know something because they just weren't talking, right? So there is this need of how do we help those people reconnect, right? Since we're talking about connection as one of the key themes here, how do you help people reconnect and find those roles and how to find meaning? And I also remember working with veterans who were OEF, OIF, who were just coming back and starting back into college. So I had college student return veterans who were like, I can't, like these freshman people I'm in class with are weird. They're talking about like Felicity and TV shows. And I was on the battlefield helping people like, what are they talking about? And why are their lives so insignificant? Right. And it was this whole adjustment of how do I even talk to my peers who are technically my peers, but not really peer. They're not in the same developmental phase that I was. And so there are lots of times where there's a whole bunch of adjustment that needs to happen in lots of different ways. And all of it, I think, is centered on that idea of adjusting to reconnect. How do you reconnect in all those ways? And I think that's why gambling, I will just point out, like, the reason that people gamble is that it's the rules. It is a very structured, you know what the games are, you know where to go. Like in some ways so a lot of people gamble to cope because when life is really uncertain, I will bring some certainty. I can do this thing and sometimes I win money. So that seems pretty exciting. Like it can in some ways feel like a thing that finally there's at least some domain of my life that feels certain and I know how to do this.
No matter where you are.
Yes.
Like you could play poker overseas, you can play poker here, and it's the same game. You don't even have to need to know the language.
Yeah.
You just sit and play the game.
And I'm I'm going to add one more piece to this if I can. If you take all of that mush it together and then take somebody like myself who went through a gambling addiction and then is getting into recovery to try to make that connection. And I'll talk about my wife who struggled mightily with my addiction and wanted me to talk about it and wanted me to give her a lot of information on what was happening and why it was happening so she could better understand the addiction and what I was going through. It's hard enough for her to tell me how I feel. Now you're asking me to describe an addiction that, unless you've been through it, is very difficult to describe. And it created a lot of friction between us. Now, thankfully, she got herself into a program where she can better understand it. And she's done a lot of work for herself to get there. But it just heightens it even more that you're stepping into a situation where you feel like an outsider to begin with, especially for a recently transitioning, veteran. You bring in a gambling addiction into it, and now you're trying to untangle a couple of different things with somebody who doesn't even understand the first thing, and it can get messy.
I'd really like to expand on the family piece a little bit. As the daughter of a World War II veteran, when I was growing up, all of my uncles, all of my adult cousins, they all served, and that was something that when you had family get-togethers, the conversations would come up. And we always felt outside, and we couldn't. We were told, don't ask questions, just be proud. We were always told, just be proud. Your father's a hero. And yes, absolutely. Today, that's a little bit different because we have an all-volunteer Army, it's not everybody's uncle and everybody's cousin. And I imagine, even though there were no family services for us back then, how important is it for family to be told by the VA, by the military, that we have services for you too? And do they exist? Can family members get help? What does that look like?
Yeah, there's definitely family services, and particularly couple services. Anybody that's having any, marital issues, there are couple specific services throughout the VA system, which is very helpful. And there's a lot of online, assists with, my military family member, is having this, or my veteran family member is having that, and some assist with that. And more and more where we bring couples and families in. I have couples frequently in my room, my office. We have very specific ways of how we approach this and how we code this. More and more as we see, in the mental health and gambling fields gambling treatment fields is the more that you have these this collaboration with family members, the research shows that the outcomes are much better. So, creating these connections. We had, family groups where we would have the family members call in, to a conference call line. That was always really interesting to help people in their own recovery as their loved one was recovering, and really helping them understand that their road to recovery is not their loved one's road to recovery. It's a separate road to recovery, a la Gam-Anon and Al-Anon, but really important. And I'll borrow a Al-Anon saying of, being really mindful of not getting in their hula hoop too, not trying to control everything they're doing. And a lot of what I do is I reference Sheila Wexler's work, because I think she's just been really key in helping family members work with, their role as a loved one for someone with problem gambling. So yeah, more and more, I think the entire field is leaning toward, appreciating the role of the entire family. And I think that's our jobs, to ask that, to include that. I got to say, by and large, a lot of people say, no, I don't want my family member involved. But when they do, we certainly bring them in. But there's a lot of times there's still that kind of secrecy. I don't want to tell them. Maybe it's protecting them, maybe it's shame, it can be pretty complex.
And I think that's when a family member needs to know it doesn't have to be involved in your loved one's recovery. And go back to that. It's your recovery. Go work on that. Go work on you. Become the healthiest you can be. So I'd like to ask each of you, because you've talked about some great resources and we will certainly post them on our website, but if you could share maybe one or two resources that you think are crucial, whether it's your podcast, Dave, or whether it is something that Garden Reserve Family Support Services, what are some of the things you would mention to folks to check into?
I'll go ahead and jump in and just say that, my podcast, in some of the episodes within my podcast, will even reference further resources as I get, certain guests on and things like that. So it's just fall in the Problem Gambling podcast for military service members and veterans. And I think that link was actually put onto the comments earlier today. So there's a link right there. And then the only other thing I'll reference, the National Council on Problem Gambling hosts a website called Operation Responsible Gambling, which also provides stories and links to different resources as well.
Great.
What I do, I always invite people to call and talk. I don't have a secretary. People call me directly. Sometimes that's a lot, but that's okay. I mean, I think what's really important is tailoring to people's needs. And so as much as we can, what I think is really important is connecting with People's Council for Problem Gambling. There's so many amazing councils out there that do amazing work, and creating these connections between the councils for problem gambling and the VA and the DOD. I think it's really, we have to all do this together. And really help think through this. And as we learn more and more, we can help think through this and unmask sort of like what seems very like mysterious, and help people in the best way possible.
I will ditto all those. Of course, I'm also a little biased that the Evergreen Council on Problem Gambling, who is clearly sponsoring this, probably has a number of resources people will look at. I was quickly trying to find something that I will send later on, but there is a model that already exists that, again, started mostly out of the VAs and others, but it is called SBIRT, the Screening, Brief Intervention, and Referral to Treatment model, and it has been adapted for problem gambling. So there is a clinician guide on a step-by-step way to do that. I think it's by, if I'm looking right, like
CAMH.
Yeah. Well, Cam had it also, as Massachusetts has one.
Okay.
At US. I was like, Canada's always slightly ahead of us. So I will say, the first one I ever read was the one that was developed by Cam up in Canada. And as I was quickly Googling as we're talking, there is one now at Massachusetts that looks like that there's available too. And so I would encourage at least people who are both treatment providers or, as again, always leaders of treatment programs, to read up on this stuff and to see both how your already existing knowledge can be adapted and easily implemented, and that there are already really good models. And for those who are non-clinicians, to know that you should be asking for evidence-based treatments that actually work for problem gambling. As someone who does a bunch of research in this area, we have effective treatments. It's about getting you in the door and finding, hopefully, as we've said before, the right relationship to get you started. And also, as someone who works in what I would call harm reduction and relapse prevention, you will have lapses. This is a trial and error, and you will get it eventually. One of the things I remember, like what Dave was saying, what was brought out to me was really part of what this is that people who have gambling problems can't imagine their life being different. And what we try to do over time is actually offer them evidence that their life can get better because they choose to, that a choice that they are making has a real impact. And what you tend to see is an increase of their self-confidence over time of, I can say no to this, I can do other things with this, I can make my life better. And that sometimes, instead of focusing on the gambling problem per se, but increasing someone's self-confidence that their life can be different, is the all-inspiring hope. And will you still struggle? Will it be hard? Of course it will. But at the same time, I have been in this field for almost 30 years, and I am amazed by the amount of change I see people do all the time that they never, when you ask them, they thought was never possible. So my always is what's funny is I have the hope, and I'm trying to pass on the hope to others that they too can bring about a change that really will make a difference in their life. And as Heather said, one of the better outcomes is quality of life. Not did you stop gambling, is your life better? And primarily because sometimes quitting gambling is the way to make your life better, or at least reducing your gambling, or having like some step in the right direction is going to be better for your quality of life. And really, that's what we're really after. Instead of just focusing on the problem, it's the bigger picture. That's what I'm trying to think about.
So you started us in a really great way to end out. We've just got a few more minutes, and I want to ask one last question, but this has been a tremendous conversation, and one that we will continue because we can't begin to unpack everything we need to unpack in 45 minutes or an hour. But I would like, starting with Heather and then Ty and then ending with Dave, if there was one key thought you would like people to carry with them away about how we best serve our service members, active duty veterans, families, what would that one simple thought be that you would want them to carry?
Oh, wow.
I always end with a tough one, Heather.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I think I think if we approach it with appreciation, and have that in mind, I think when we approach something with an appreciation in mind for that person and where they sit, I think we can be the most helpful to them. So I think it's really like putting yourself in their shoes and appreciating, that life, that their moment, their stuff. That's what I would encourage people to do is just appreciate.
Love it. Ty?
I'm going to pick a dialectic that two things that seem diametrically opposed to each other can actually be true. That what you're dealing with is a real and significant problem if you're dealing with problem gambling. And at the same time, you're worth changing and having your life get better. And that while those seem diametrically opposed, I actually know that both can be true. And so trying to appreciate how hard this can be, even just calling up a hotline or texting a chat message or listening to a podcast that Dave is offering, any of those things are a step in the right direction. And you never know where those are, like, it's that alternative possibility of something better may come along. So I think that's that noticing both can be true, that this is hard and you have the power to make a difference.
Great. And Dave, as the person with lived experience here in recovery, what are your thoughts?
This was actually an easy question for me because I end most of my podcasts with this message. There are two things that I would want to get across very clearly. And I think that any of us that's in a position to do so has a charge to do this, which is to get the message out that, number one, you're not alone. And number two, there is hope. It's really that simple. You're not alone. There are more of us out there than you could possibly know, and we're here for you, and that there is a way out. You just got to step into it.
Beautiful way to end this. Thank you all for all the work you do in helping others. Been a pleasure to join in this conversation with you today, and I look forward to future conversations. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.